Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Kristen Evangelista. I'm the director of the University Galleries. On behalf of the University Galleries and the Center for New Art, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's Artist-in-Residence talk, which will be given by Maria Lux. The Artist-in-Residence program is a collaboration between the University Galleries and the Center for New Art. Under the leadership of the center's director, Professor Michael Reese, who's here in the front, the center explores aspects of the use of technology in the arts. The Artist-in-Residence program provides access to the center's digital fabrication laboratory that includes cutting-edge technologies such as a computer numeric control mill, laser cutter, 3D scanner, and 3D printers. Past artists-in-residence have included Michael Joaquin Gray, Richard Klein, Chris Manzione, Katie Schimmert, and Benjamin Phelan. Maria Lux was our artist-in-residence for 6 weeks this past fall. During that time, she explored various technologies and actively engaged with undergraduate and graduate students as well as local high school students. Lux is a cross-disciplinary artist who investigates our relationship to animals, a relationship that is increasingly mediated by technology. She has participated in more than 30 exhibitions across the country, as well as numerous solo and two-person exhibitions. She earned her BFA from Iowa State University and received her MFA from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in 2012. She is the recipient of various awards and grants, including the Illinois Arts Council Artist Project Grant. Today, Lux will provide insight on her newest work, which is on view in the East Gallery at the University Galleries. If you haven't seen the show, I encourage you to stop by. She explores how technology is a means for re-envisioning our relationship with the natural world. I just want to make a few thank yous, so bear with me. This will take just a few minutes, but I don't want to forget anyone because this is truly a collaboration that we're very grateful for all the people who made it possible. We're fortunate to lead this program, including the exhibition and catalog through funding in part from the National Endowment for the Arts Artworks program. The University Galleries also receive funding from the New Jersey State Council on the Arts. We are also grateful for the university support and the administration, including the College of Arts and Communication and our dean, Daryl Joseph Moore. I would like to thank the artist for her tremendous creative investment in this opportunity. In addition, I would like to acknowledge the Artist Selection Committee, which selected the Artist-in-Residence, which includes Art Department Chair Lauren Rizzore, Professor Alejandro Enreyes, Program Assistant Emily Johnson, and Professor Reese, of course. The galleries are grateful to the staff for realizing this exhibition, including Program Assistant Emily Johnson, Visual Resources Curator Heidi Rempel, Graduate Assistant David Distilio, and our work study students Megan Fletcher, Chris Mazzillo, and Davy Peralta. I would like to thank Professor Tom Uline, who's designing the forthcoming catalog, which will be available in February. And again, I would like to thank Professor Reese at the Center for New York, the graduate students in the art department, and I hope I haven't forgotten anyone. But thank you again for coming. Now let me introduce Maria. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Okay, I'm going to cue this up here. Okay. So I want to start out with a whole bunch of thank yous too. I hope that's not too boring, but it's fun to stand up and take credit for a project. But I think that for a lot of artists, and I know especially for me, making work is like a whole community effort, and it depends on a lot of other people. So I want to make sure to make that visible at a moment like this one. So first, I want to thank Professor Michael Reese for his vision for this residency and bringing making this opportunity available. I really want to thank the graduate student assistants who dedicated a lot of their time and energy and were really invested in helping me finish my work, even though they had lots of other things going on. So that includes Brian Sandilands, Tyler Zeleny, Dave Dastilio, James Brem, and Edmar Lopez, if he's here somewhere too. All of them, they have tremendous expertise in running the machinery and fixing files and making things happen that I couldn't have done in the short amount of time that I was here without their help. And I really want to thank Kristen, Evangelista, and Emily Johnson for their months and months of planning and organizing to make something like this happen. I think I was a lot more work than your usual artist since I was coming from halfway across the country, and so the extra effort that you guys put in made a big difference, and I feel really spoiled working with you guys. Just made the exhibition so easy. And I also want to thank some friends and other professionals that aren't here in this room but should be acknowledged, people that came down this weekend and helped me stick pedals on things, and the people who take photos of work, the people who make grants available, the people who fund all of this stuff that makes art making come to fruition. So, and of course, I also want to thank all of you guys for coming to this lecture today and for taking a look at the work. So those are my thank yous. Today, what I'd like to do is talk really generally about my practice so you have some background. And then I'll give a few examples of previous work for context and just so you're not stuck looking at only one thing the whole time. And then I will spend the rest of the time talking about the new work that's here and try to give you some insight into what I was thinking when I made it, and also in particular how the residency experience shifted the kind of work that I made here. And then I'll of course leave some time for questions at the end, so keep that in mind. So these are some of my thank you photos of earlier on in the process, various people who helped with things. So this is just a screenshot of like the homepage of my website, so you can just see little snippets of things while I talk about my general practice. So really broadly, I'm interested in knowledge production, like how we know what we know and how different disciplines figure those things out. And so I consider myself as, my work is kind of a form of research and also like a way of engaging with other people's research and thinking through ideas. And I think art making holds a lot of potential for contributing back to other kinds of like scholarly and real world conversations. And so I think that'll make a lot more sense when you see how I kind of borrow from other disciplines and use other people's research in my previous work and especially in the work that's here. And so more specifically than just general knowledge production, I'm interested in the way animals figure into that. So throughout history and now, animals have played a really essential role in kind of how we define ourselves, how we understand the world around us. For example, in a really literal way, like we cut them open to see how they work so we can figure out how we work. We test things out on them. We like observe their behavior to try to understand our own. There's all the metaphorical and symbolic uses of animals in art and literature and religion and all of that. And the kind of day-to-day relationships that we have with animals, that we live with, hunting them, eating them, having them as pets, all of that. So it's only really been in the last, I would say maybe 30 years that this whole subject of animals has really been taken seriously in like an academic context. And I'm really excited about that. And so I like to be part of those kinds of conversations. So as Kristen said, all my work has to do with animals and kind of this meaning of animals and knowledge production. And as you can see, I use a lot of different materials in my work. I choose what I make based on the content that I'm thinking about. So it's also really fun because I get to learn new things all the time and try stuff that I've never done before. My background is in very traditional like painting and drawing. So the last few years have just been like a really exciting time to explore a lot of different media. So what I'm going to do is just pick a couple of these to talk to you about briefly, and I'm going to focus on sharing like what the source material was for these or how the projects began, without going into excessive detail about the project itself, because I think that'll just make the current work make a little bit more sense. So this project is called Red Planet. It was an installation, and one of the pieces of source material for this was this book from the 1940s and 50s called The Ecology of Invasions of Animals and Plants by this British ecologist named Charles Elton. And that book uses a lot of war language that kind of set the tone for invasive species management for like time since then. So I was thinking about that book, and then I was also thinking about the really famous War of the Worlds radio broadcast about the alien invasion, and everybody went nuts and thought it was really happening. So that was another thing in mind, and then I was also thinking about all this research that had to do with prairie dogs and their language, and especially prairie dogs in the American West, where they're not an invasive species, but they're treated like they are. So I ended up making this kind of I don't know, vignette or something of the stuffed prairie dogs listening to War of the Worlds on the radio. And then I did a series of wall dioramas that, read in order, they tell you a fictional story about the prairie dogs being sent to Mars to colonize, and NASA finding them later and deciding whether or not they're going to blow them up because they're invading Mars. And so that sort of used the kind of the rhetoric of the ecology book, and also the conventions of invasion literature, which is the kind of literature that the War of the Worlds is, to sort of create a fictional thing. Here's a close-up of the prairie dogs on Mars. And so these all had wall text to explain the narrative. That's one thing with my work you'll see with the current installation I'll talk about, and with other projects. It's always a struggle for me to figure out where to put the connections to this research, or how to give the audience access to that. I know a lot of people deal with that in their work. You've got all this stuff you've read, you've got all this stuff you're thinking about, and then you want to tell people, but it's just really hard to get it across. So I've tried a lot of different things. This one involved just these little, like, typical exhibition labels. Here's another project. It's a little older. It's called GOAT, and it's about surveillance in production agriculture. But the way I arrived at this was this thing. So the original source material for this project was a catalog. There were these catalogs that were printed like in the 1800s during like the fraternal lodge craze, like Masonic lodges and that sort of thing. And these catalogs were sent directly to lodge leaders, and they sold stuff you would need if you were in a fraternal lodge. So no one else saw these catalogs but these like guys. And so someone found these catalogs, reprinted them, and I stumbled upon this thing on the left that's called a mechanical goat. And you can imagine what you might use it for. It's an initiation exercise. So you put a blindfold on someone, and then they have to try to stay on it while somebody pushes it around. The axles are off, so the wheels like do this while you ride it. And I fell in love with that thing because it's crazy and wonderful, and I wanted to make one. So that's how that project started. And then I happened upon some contemporary legislation that was talking about ag-gag laws. I don't know if you've heard of them, but basically it's a lot of laws in a lot of different states that make it illegal to videotape inside like a confinement facility, or to get a job in an agricultural production place with the purpose of exposing what's going on in there. So I thought, this whole secrecy of this lodge stuff and this weird goat thing, and the secrecy of modern agriculture, there's some connection there. So I ended up using some text about that legislation, and also some text from a contemporary catalog selling fake security cameras, because I was interested in the idea that you don't need a real security camera to keep you from doing bad things. They just need to think they're being watched. And what does it mean when you tell people they're definitely not being watched? What are they going to do without any kind of supervision? So that's how that project emerged. And I have to share this because this is one of my favorite parts about it. Do you guys know who Temple Grandin is? Some people probably. So she's a really famous animal scientist, and she is autistic, and she uses her autism to kind of inform her perspective of how to deal with animals and production situations. And she happened to go to the University of Illinois, where I went to grad school, for her PhD. And so the university has in their permanent collections a bunch of her like schematic drawings that she did. So I was able to borrow one for this exhibition. And so this is her drawing of a ritual sheep slaughter. And I loved it because of the X's for eyes, like that's how she decided that you can tell when the thing is dead, is that it has little X's. I was like so charmed by that. So anyway, I was excited to include that in it, and excited that it had this connection of like ritual stuff, like the Masonic Lodge rituals, and sheep and goats are kind of related in our ideas of maybe what weird things go on behind closed doors with sheep and goats and that sort of thing. So that was kind of what I was thinking, and why I included that part also. And another example of a previous piece that had something to do with sheep, because that's what I'm going to be talking about later. And this is the last one of previous work that I'll show you. This is called Monarchy, and this one was in pretty direct response to one book, which was unusual for me. As you can tell, I usually pull from a whole bunch of different sources, and I look for associations between them, or repetitions or weird connections, and then kind of build an installation from that. And this piece started in a different way. I was invited to contribute a piece and an essay to this book project and traveling exhibition that was all in response to the book, The Sexual Politics of Meat by Carol J. Adams. Some people have heard of that one too. I hadn't read it before I was invited to participate, so it was really cool to read a book with the idea that I was going to make something about that book when I was done. And I ended up finding a couple other sources to add to it, including this Men's Health article that was all about how American men should eat more red meat because that's really part of our national identity. And a lot of her book is about power being situated and related to meat eating and male power and throughout history and all these kinds of things. So it became this weird, like, the article that I found was like a perfect illustration of her book in a contemporary way. And so I made this crown, which is a Burger King crown you might recognize, that's covered in all of these, America-colored jewels and plastic cows. Okay. And with all of this, like I said, there'll be time for questions at the end, so I can elaborate on these more if you'd like to know more, because there's obviously a lot of details in them, but I just don't want to talk too long about any of this old stuff. So we can talk about that more later. But now I'll move on to the work that is just finished and up in the galleries right now. You'll have to forgive my photos. We had professional photos taken this morning, but obviously there's not enough time to get them by now. So these are ones that I took, last night, and they're not the greatest quality. But at least you'll be able to see what I'm talking about if you haven't had a chance to go over there and take a look at the work yet. And I'll just tell you a little bit about what's in there too, in case you haven't seen it. So the current show consists of this large parade float. It's completely covered in artificial flowers. I lost count of how many. I know there's 8,000 petals on the base, and then who knows how many are on the rest of it. But all artificial flowers, and it's made of styrofoam. This was created on the CNC mill here. The sheep were carved using computer-generated files, and you can see a side view of it. There is also about 3.5-minute stop motion video. It's a miniature, it's like parade TV coverage of a miniature rose parade with a miniature 3D printed version of this float as kind of the star of the parade. And it has voiceover and some music and stuff, which I can talk a little bit about too. Here's a screenshot from the parade. So I built this whole tabletop size Pasadena street, and then made a stop motion video out of it. You'll see some more stills from that later too. And that's the little 3D print and a volunteer for the parade. Their official volunteers are called white suiters, and they dress like that. And the Tournament of Roses Association says that their job is to shepherd the floats to and from the float barns, and I thought that was too wonderful of a coincidence not to include in the exhibition. So this is in the corner, and then there's a little piece of text that explains who that little volunteer is and the miniature float. And then there's also a shelf with the books that were really influential in making this project. I have, like I said before, it's always hard to figure out how to include reference materials in pieces. And so I've tried a lot of different things. Sometimes I put books in the installation, like these rats are wrapped in the H.G. Wells book, The Country of the Blind. And in this case, I designed a fake cover for it that fit what I was thinking about with the project, and then I just sort of built it into the piece so that the audience would at least get that there's a reference there, but not really understand. You don't have to read the text, you don't have to know the whole story. This is a project where I just made up a book because there wasn't a good comparative mammalian anatomy book that was just about eyes, but that's what I wanted people to think about. So in that case, I just sort of invented a book and had it in the piece. Other times I'll just quote people and use a real traditional academic citation with parentheses and that sort of thing. As someone who likes to go between the art world discussions and sometimes more academic discussions, like presenting at conferences or writing things, essays and stuff like that for books, it's interesting because all of those environments really, require normal citation, like you would do writing a paper. And then art things don't always do that or don't always expect that. And so it's kind of fun to play with how that information gets credited and how I provide access to the audience for that. Here's another piece where the books that were important in the generation of the project are just props in the installation. So this was modeled after, those big Natural History Museum displays where they put like a bunch of deer in the forest or whatever. This is the dining room of an amateur scientist. And so the books on top of his desk are all about microscopes and the history of science and stuff. And then there's explanation about what those books are all about in the text underneath so that people at least have some idea of what I was thinking when I made it. So I'll go back a little bit. So this project, we decided that it would be nice to have the books accessible to viewers so you can actually like thumb through them and read through if you want. So I really like the fact that they're sitting there as kind of testament to the fact that they're important to making the work, but you can also like actually read them and they're not kind of trapped in the installation like some of my other pieces are. So I'll return to how these texts were important and what they say a little bit later. But first I want to touch on the way that the structure of the residency affected the work, because I think that's important to talk about too. As Kristen mentioned, the residency is designed for people to come in and use the technology. And I've used a lot of different technical processes in my work before. I have access to a CNC router back home, and I use laser cutters a lot. And I have a background in graphic design, so I kind of work natively in Illustrator all the time anyway. So I'm always using those kinds of tools. But when I saw the call for this residency, I thought it would be a great opportunity to really think about what it means to use those technologies and how they can influence the content of the work and become a part of the content of the work instead of just kind of a means to an end like I had previously been doing. So that's what I talked about in my application, was that I wanted to come here and really think about that and make the tools part of the work. So I knew that I wanted technology to be a big part of the subject of the work. And I also knew that I wanted to make a parade float. These are the things I knew coming in. Otherwise, it was like wide open. I knew I wanted to make a parade float because it just seemed like it would be really fun to do. And probably like many of you, I usually have a bunch of things like in the back of my head that I'm hoping to get to someday, but you just have to find the right opportunity to do them. And a parade float is not something that you can do in your apartment without a budget. And so this seemed like an amazing opportunity to do something big that I couldn't do at home. So that was in the back of my mind. I just have to show you guys these, because so the top few are American Rose Parade floats. The bottom two are kind of the Dutch counterpart of the flower parade in the Netherlands. And I'm just like so amazed at the differences in kind of the aesthetic quality. Like all of our floats are very like narrative and pretty believable, and they just sort of like they're a little imaginative, but mostly like what you'd expect. There's Defy Gravity. There's no narrative. This like crazy city. It's like a ball of a city. They're amazing to me, and I would have loved to have made something like that, but it kind of didn't actually fit with what I wanted to do. But I just wanted to share them because I had not seen those before and was amazed at the differences. So anyway, I was thinking about parade floats. I started doing research on the Rose Parade because I loved the flower texture and was kind of interested in that history. So that was part of what was feeding into my thinking at the beginning of the residency. And then I also had this story that I was thinking about. And this is a weird like Photoshop collage mock-up thing that I made early on that I didn't end up using, but I'm using it as an illustration for this story. If you heard the video and the installation, you would have heard some of the story because I kind of embedded it in the voiceover of the parade coverage. But this is the story that ended up being what the float is about. And I heard it when I was at a conference. So there was this artist who is also a sheep shearer by trade. That's what she does. And she was talking about her work in the North Atlantic. And she just sort of offhandedly mentioned this story about sheep, where up there, this is like a photo from the area in the background. So you get a sense of what the environment is like. There's all these islands, there's all this icy water between them, and they have to move sheep back and forth all the time. And since the sheep are bred to have a lot more wool than ancient sheep. If a sheep falls in the water when they're traveling back and forth, they get so heavy that you can't pull them back into the boat. Their wool takes on all this water, it's like a big sponge, and you just have to let them drown. And she just mentioned this, and this was like something I wrote down, was like, that's the craziest story, I'm gonna remember that forever, even if I don't want to. So that was in the back of my mind, and I decided that's kind of what I wanted to make the float about. It's also interesting that the sheep this isn't in the installation, but I just think it's fascinating. If it just rains too much and they're in the field, the same thing can happen. Like their wool can take on all this water and they just collapse under their own weight and then they just die out there in the field. So I actually called this colleague when I was working on the project, and I wanted to kind of touch base with her, make sure I remembered the story the way I thought I did, and see what else she could tell me. And that was one of the things she told me, that that it's really frustrating to her to watch these animals that are so at risk. They have to be sheared by humans in order to survive, basically. But that they wouldn't have been that way, that it's really a result of many, many thousands of years of human breeding to make them absurdly fluffy so we can get more wool out of them, and it ends up being really dangerous to the sheep. And that was an interesting thought to me, kind of relating back to this idea of technology. I mean, domestication is a technology, breeding is a technology, and thinking about the way that we've sort of influenced these animals to become high producing for us, but like a danger to themselves. So that was in the back of my mind. But I was really struggling at the beginning to think, how am I going to connect ideas of technology, the sheep story, and then my desire to make a parade float into anything? So that's where all of these texts come in. So the first few weeks I was here, I spent a lot of time reading and writing things, and it feels like doing nothing, so it can be really frustrating, but it's really important for me to do anyway. So I revisited a lot of these texts that I had thought about a long time ago and just kind of kept notes on, but hadn't really made anything out of. And so through reading through these things and looking for connections between these texts, I started to see some ideas emerge that were interesting to me. One of them is kind of embodied by the book on the far right, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is a very famous book. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, and many people make work about it. I've made other projects about it too. And it became the movie Blade Runner, so you might be more familiar with that. It seems like just such a rich book to make things out of. I keep going back to it all the time. And I think that one kind of embodies sort of one perspective on animals and technology that I started thinking about. This is another one of these weird Photoshop mock-ups that didn't become anything, made of internet images, of the electric sheep on the roof of the building. So if you don't know the story, basically war technology has resulted in the fact that there are no more living animals left to speak of, that all the real animals are gone. And so in an effort to like keep animals around, there's all these fake animals, electric animals that are very realistic but ultimately not alive, that people take care of. And I think that book for me kind of sums up this perspective that technology is like the cause of all these extinctions, the cause of all these problems. It's our pollution, it's our industrialization, it's our mining and our agricultural practices that are causing mass extinctions all around us. That's why our coral reefs are disappearing. That's why our forests are gone, loss of biodiversity, all of this kind of stuff. And so you kind of see technology as the enemy and human involvement as the enemy in this case, and like this is what we're headed for, is this, horrible dystopic future. And I started thinking about how what a parade has to do with that. And I think it's very, so I think part of that view of like, oh, humans are causing all these problems and we're ruining the earth, there's kind of this built-in nostalgia for the time when we weren't doing that. Like, if we could just go back to when we were simple farmers and we lived on mountains and we just herded the sheep up and down, like everything would be fine. And I think that's a really problematic thing to think too, because obviously like we don't like, I don't know, dying of smallpox. I mean, there's been like things that, we really appreciate about not going back in time to really difficult agricultural, pre-industrial society. So I was thinking about how the parade is really a good example of this. It's like, by definition, always forward moving, always forward thinking. It's just going in one direction always, but it's like obsessed with its own history and the past and nostalgia. When I was researching the Rose Parade in particular, I would say like half of the parade themes are about like the good old days, remembering childhood, remembering the past. And so I thought that was an interesting way to kind of include that perspective of looking forward and also looking back. And then another alternative way of thinking about our technology is like, maybe it's what we can use it to save everything. Like there's so much optimism about it. If we can just figure out ways to clone things that are disappearing and rescue all these endangered species and mediate all of the horrible, pollution that we're doing, then we can save the planet instead. And so there's this author, Ursula K. Hess, I think that's how you say her last name, and she wrote an essay in the third from the right book, this So Ontologies book, that I had read a long time ago, and actually talks about she talks about Durandoid's Dream of Electric Sheep in her essay, among other things. But she had an analysis of the movie Jurassic Park, which is that this film, is dealing with like the most famous extinction ever, right? And in the film, science is so optimistic. It's like, look what we can do. We brought back the dinosaurs. Like, if we can do that, we can do anything, because we brought back something that's been extinct forever. And so she talks about how maybe science is the savior in this case. And I also love the fact that she makes a point about the aesthetics of the white coats, actually, like the white lab coats, and how this authority and this we have this under control. And I love that little connection with the white suitors also in the parade. So that was like another weird thing that was like, well, I don't know if this means anything, but it means something to me. So I saw that as a sign to keep going, keep thinking about this, see what else this might mean. But Hess also points out, and I think this was especially interesting to me, that Jurassic Park also kind of has a counter argument within itself, which is, yeah, there's all this optimism, look what we did with science, but then the dinosaurs spend the whole rest of the movie destroying science. Like, they break the computers, they rip up the electrical stuff, and in I think all the movies, at least the first two, they ruin cars. Like, that's a big part of the movie, and I love that, because the cars are such a representative symbol of our technical progress. So I was thinking about that in relationship to the parade. In the video, you'll hear this little snippet, but it talks about the history of the parade and how originally when the parade started, it was back in 1890, so this is before cars were really a thing. And so it was all horse-drawn, everything. And then at a certain point, they wanted to include cars in the parade because people invented cars. And so they put the cars at the back so that they wouldn't scare the horses. Like, this is all centered on horses, and everything was centered on horses. That's how you got places. They decided that they wouldn't hold the parade on Sundays because they didn't want to disrupt horses that were parked outside of churches, because they would have gotten upset and then interrupted the church services. And so then, of course, horses are replaced by cars, not only in the parade, but in society in general. And this represents this big move for cities and for people for not having like this day-to-day interaction with horses like they used to have, and we just have cars now. So I think it's a good symbol of like how animals kept getting kind of pushed away through the use of technology, not made extinct, but just made distant from where we are. So I liked Hess's analysis of Jurassic Park. I wanted to include that in here somehow. And so in the stop motion video, there's like a little cut scene, like it's a clip of this moment in Jurassic Park where the T-Rex flips over the car, and there's a Jurassic Park car in the parade, and so that's why, that's how it makes sense in the video. And I was thinking more about what else in my story that I'm trying to generate here kind of represents that nature coming back and kind of destroying technology, that nature has power over us still, and that even though we have the greatest intentions to do these things with our technology, we think we're so great, really nature is stronger than we are in the end. And we can feel maybe a little afraid, but maybe optimistic at the fact that whatever we try, life will find a way, like Dr. Malcolm or whatever says in the movie, that there's still hope in just that nature will fix itself and that we don't really have to do it. And so I was thinking about that with the parade and this role of like rain and water as another recurring thing. So of course it's really dangerous to the sheep to get wet because they'll drown. And in the history of the parade, it was dangerous for it to rain on the parade because all of these flowers that are put on the rose parade floats, they can absorb a lot of water because they're natural. And so it becomes really like an engineering problem for them to figure out how to make these parade floats that can accept all this water. And so there's these like ominous clouds in the background, to me sort of representing this idea that like nature is still really powerful, and we might think we're doing a lot of damage or we might think we're fixing things, but in reality it can just come in and ruin the whole thing, and it's going to be fine without us. Like rain clouds don't care, right? So that's kind of how I was trying to get that part of Ursula Ursula Hess's argument into the parade float and kind of thinking about whether, complicating the issue of technology a little bit more. And then as I was reading, there was sort of a third viewpoint, which I think I like the most out of all of them. It's very provocative and philosophical kind of idea, which comes from the book Electric Animal by Akira Mizuta Lippitt. And Lippitt is a film scholar, and so and a very very invested in like Derrida and a lot of philosophers that I'm not super well versed in. But his kind of, to overgeneralize his argument, he suggests that maybe animals are not being destroyed by technology completely or being replaced by technology, but that technology is like folding animals into itself as we advance things. He calls it incorporated animality. So his example is how we still measure the strength of cars and horsepower. So the horses are gone, but they're still like in this little way included in the car. Again, this representative technology of the car was an exciting connection to me, that was an example in his argument as well. And his broader argument is that, like, in particular, animals are absorbed into film. So he's got this whole theory about cinematography and how, if you remember Edward Muybridge, the photographer that did the first like stop motion with mostly animals, and that became like early animation, the name animation, for instance. So he kind of builds this argument that animals are like embedded in film itself, that they're part of this like only there for a moment, always like perpetually dying but never dead, because they're never really gone and they can't really die in the first place because they're not conscious of their own mortality. This is kind of the more philosophical stuff. But I thought that was an interesting idea, to imagine animals and technology merging together a little more than our whole polar opposite, technology is bad, technology is good argument. And of course, there's a lot of other people who talk about that with like Cyborg Manifesto and ideas of much more contemporary ideas of how we merge with technology. So that's sort of what I was settling on, is like there's kind of these three viewpoints that are mixing together in this work. And then, I wanted to share this quote with you because it was something else that that Lippitt says in his book that kind of tied a lot of things together for me. So he said that despite the distance of the animal being from the human world, the uncanny proximity of animals to human beings necessarily involves them in any attempt to define human essence. The effort to define the human being has usually required a preliminary gesture of exclusion, a rhetorical animal sacrifice. And so to me, that was like this great kind of tying everything up moment, because of course sheep are known for being part of sacrifice, and throughout history they're like a sacrificial animal. And that we need animals in some way to define ourselves. We have to like always keep drawing that line, like humans are the only animals that do this, or that we're somehow special from them, and that's how we can understand ourselves. Really, this is back to this bigger issue of trying to define ourselves and use animals to do that. And so it's like we need them around in order to know who we are, but they keep getting pushed away through technology and through extinction. And so what do we do about that? How do we fill in the hole that they've left? And that leaves me to think more about these fake animals, these artificial things that don't die, like these, artificial flowers that are going to be beautiful forever because they're never alive in the first place. And what does that mean, and how does that feel to have things that are just simulations of the real thing? Does it serve the same role? Can we still like define ourselves and feel comfortable being around these false versions of animals in nature, or do we need actual living beings to complete ourselves? And I don't really necessarily have like an answer about that, but I think that's what I was left thinking about after all of this reading and all of this making, and then trying to make sense of what I made, and engaging with discussions with people. That's sort of what I hope that my work does, is present a lot of things that maybe don't go together to begin with, and offer avenues to think a little bit differently about them. I see it kind of like some of the essays that I read, where it's analysis of stuff and bringing things together, but also using the tools of art making, which is, all this texture and the size and the awkwardness of the stop motion video, which relates to that Muybridge thing I was talking about, and kind of trying to use all of these tools to bring references from all of the different sources together into one installation. How am I doing on time? Okay. Yeah, so I think that's how I would sum up this work. And there's one more still from the video, Marching Sheep. So at this point, if anybody would like to ask questions, I love answering questions. I can talk about this work, I can talk about residencies in general. And if you would like me to bring up, I've got my website ready, so if there's any like other pieces you want to see images of or have questions about, I can easily bring those up too. It sounds like we need to like give people microphones so that the video can hear you. So I guess just raise your hand and then someone can bring you a microphone.
With so much going on in your work and all these different pieces playing roles in it, I guess, it could be like really complex for someone to just look at it and understand all the stuff going on. So that's why you put like your little notes or whatever. Mm-hmm. So at first glance, like if someone's seeing your work for the first time and not understanding all this, do you think that the work becomes more reflective of yourself or of the ideas that you're trying to put across in it?
That's an interesting question. Like if, because I'm the only one that really knows that it becomes more like something about me. Yeah. I hope that I provide enough access points so that it doesn't have to be too much about like the idiosyncrasies of my interests, you know? Some of the connections are admittedly very like loose or weird, like, oh, look, the white coats are the same. Like that, people probably don't get that or aren't that interested in that, and some of it is just pleases me. But I think some of the broader connections, I hope, are like genuine things that might be worth thinking about. And I also find that other people get different weird connections that I didn't see either. Like the whole thing about the rain cloud and nature kind of asserting itself didn't occur to me until the scholar that wrote the essay for the catalog, Ron Brolio, kind of brought it up in his analysis. And I was like, I hadn't thought about rain. Like, I didn't know what the rain meant, and I couldn't really figure it out. And the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. So some of it, I feel like it's kind of a back and forth. Like, people, they are sort of like puzzles, I guess, a little bit, in that the more you use them to think about things, hopefully the more things emerge from that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Maria, I wonder if in part that whole problem about content and reference, which is so active in film, like for example, say, Kubrick's films, there's whole websites devoted to little moments in a film and what it all means and how it connects to things. I wonder if it's more native in a way to film than it is to visual art. And if visual art isn't, or if you aren't taking on a new structure of relationship within the work itself, not completely new, not isolated, but actually growing the metaphorical structure of the way art is read. I don't wonder if you have any.
That's interesting. I like that. I think that sometimes the kind of analytical apparatus that I'm borrowing from, or at least that I'm more accustomed to, because I don't do much with film or read a lot of film stuff, other than in this case, actually, is kind of just the analytical structure from like humanities research, like anthropologists, cultural studies, visual studies people who are like taking a thing like Jurassic Park, and then they just find like these really amazing tiny details and really break it down. And I think to a point where a lot of people would be like, I don't think so. Like, really, no, that's not what they were getting at. But it's like, whether it was intended or not, it's like really fruitful. And I think that's kind of what I'm trying to mirror in my process, which you're right, maybe isn't super native to art making or what people are expecting when they walk into a lot of exhibits, and so it's more challenging, like you said, to kind of get to all of that.
Here you go. Down here in front.
Hi.
Hi.
How invested are you, because it feels like you are very, in the humor of your work? Because even in the animation for the parade, is this doing anything? In the animation for the parade, all right. Hi, camera. The announcers are very stoic about, look, here come these sheep that are all fake, for prophesizing a world where all the animals are fake. And it takes place in 2068, so we're assuming they all are. But then they say, like, oh, no, they're not. And even your float, just looking at it, is like colorful and bright and it looks happy, even though it's sort of talking about like our projected like doom upon all of sheep kind. Like, how heavily invested are you in humor, or do you even consider it at all?
I definitely think about it because it's hard for me. I think a lot of things are funny, and part of why I want to share them with people is because I find them funny. Like the X's for eyes and the thing, I'm like, I just think that's cute and funny, and I want people to see it. And there's a lot of, it's almost like whether I mean to or not, that's kind of what I'm going to see and sort of bring out. I've actually thought recently, like, should these things be funny or not? Because like a friend of mine watched the video and she's like, that's hilarious. And I was like, oh, I didn't know it was supposed to be funny. Like, I didn't know that's what I was going for, but I guess it is funny. Like, I just was not, I was working on it for so long. I didn't think it was that funny anymore, but.
Well, even with the prairie dogs on Mars, NASA's going to blow up all the Mars prairie dogs. It's hilarious, but it's really depressing at the same time. Yeah, it's like Freudian analysis. But
I mean, one of the many tools we have as artists that like scientists don't get very much at all is humor. Like we can make things cute or funny, and that makes it appealing or interesting in a way that other kinds of research can't. And I guess I feel like, yeah, as much as I can use that as a strategy, all the better, because it brings something different to the table than what other researchers are already talking about. Anybody else?
There's one in the back.
So, with everything that goes into work like this, with all the different sources and things, how do you generally keep track of your process as you work? Do you find yourself mainly focusing on concept and then into execution, or do you find yourself adding a concept to it as you go, and do you just kind of jump into it?
It's like back and forth all the time. And I am, so like broadly, the process for me is like I read a lot of things or see somebody post something or whatever, and then I just keep track of it on this like secret blog. I call it a secret blog because it sounds exciting, but I just don't publish it, and it's just my stuff. And I can't remember anything otherwise. So I put everything there. I put pictures there. I put, links and stuff, whatever. And then I, like when I started this project, I like searched my secret blog for the word technology, for mechanical, for digital, for anything that I had come across in the last like 5 years that might relate to what I was thinking about, and then started rereading that to remind myself of what I had already forgotten. And so there's like that part of it. And then once you start making stuff, then new ideas start to emerge from the stuff you made. Like I did not intend to make a stop motion video from the beginning. I made the float, and then I was thinking like, cinema, this book that I was reading was all about cinema and film. And there's this, stop motion is a great thing because it's like you take a thing that's not alive and then you just mechanically move it along, and now it looks like it's alive, but it's not alive. Like, it's such a great technique for this thing I was thinking about. So then I ended up making that, and then its awkwardness contributed to me thinking of how awkward it is to make fake animals, and then started thinking about the clouds. And so it kind of like, they go back and forth, I think, for me. Which is why I think it's actually important to make the things. Like sometimes I get caught up in all the researchy stuff. People are like, well, why don't you just write a paper? It's like, yeah, I guess. I like writing. But making the things gives you the other ideas that develop into broader, more ideas. So there's two for it.
Hold on, let's go read the book. Don't ask without the mic.
In regards to the process of actually then executing the work, were there compromises that you had to make as relationship to the gallery and the experience of the physical work itself? Were there things you had to adjust as you went along in terms of changes or variations or altering the vision of that?
Yeah. Well, initially just planning to, like, it would have been cool if the float was bigger, right? Because real floats are like 3-4 times that big. They're like semi-size or whatever. But, it won't fit in the room and it won't fit through doors. And so there's like some of that early on compromise that you make because you just know that there's some logistics things to deal with. And then in just the process of like covering it in flowers, for instance, like I tried my very best to do lots of math to figure out how many flowers I needed to order, how much room they cover up. That was part of the great thing about using digital files as opposed to carving by hand, which I've done in the past for some of my other sculptural work, I was like all hand carved. And this, there was a file that could be used to calculate the surface area, which was exciting and helped a lot. But there were still some like discrepancies at the end where it's like, oh, I don't have enough to cover that part. What kind of design solution can I come up with? Should we add a border? Should we like black, let's lean them up next to each other closer. So like those kind of things that you sort of do on the fly that are fun when you have enough time, but not fun when it's like, the night before something has to be done.
I noticed something in your work, other than your fine art side. I see some 3D programming, and I see some really nice graphic design pieces, especially that invasion of the Mars. I couldn't see close-ups in the second and third, but from far away they were like professionally done. Do you do yourself, or do you have graphic designer or 3D artist for that type of the side of your?
Yeah. Well, so I mentioned I have my undergraduate degree is in graphic design, so I end up like, yeah. And whether I want to use it or not, it's like every part of my decision making is clearly from that training. Like for me, it's just like you make so many sketches and then you break it down like this, and then I make them in I do it like I said, I do everything in Illustrator because it's easy for me to work that way and try out options and stuff. But especially with the 3D stuff here, I have no experience with that software, and the machinery here is it seems that you have to have an expert knowledge of the machine itself in order to make that thing work. And so that was totally reliant on the guys here.
Either, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So like that's a case where it was not me able to do that on my own, but
That software, not just for 3D, also for graphic design pieces, it takes away your artistic feel when you're working with this beautiful work, because it's kind of technical.
yeah.
Using that software.
I like doing things digitally up to a point where that's still kind of fun. Like, I like doing this stuff in Photoshop or preparing the files or whatever is still enjoyable. But there is something that's like so satisfying about sticking pins into a foam sheep or painting something like that's just another reason why I'm like, yeah, I want to keep making the things. Like I could make virtual things or I could write papers or whatever, but I like making stuff too. So.
Hi. One of the qualities of your work that I'm attracted to when I look at is the way that you negotiate the slippery slope that you have to do when you make conceptual art, where how much is the end project concerned about being an object and how much is it concerned about being an idea. And then you have this graphic design background, which is very much about conveying ideas with visual means. What process do you go through in putting out an end product? Is the end product consequential? Is the ideas more important? How do you negotiate all of that territory between the object and between the concept and trying to get it out there?
Yeah. I think that, so as a person who learned drawing and painting in a very representational way, and someone who gets a lot of joy out of getting a good representation of something, I love oh, that looks exactly like what it's supposed to look like. That sort of translated over into my more sculptural and installation practice as a lot of, I don't know if parody is the right word, but making things that are supposed to look like something else, and you're supposed to believe that it's a float. You're supposed to believe it's a TV video and it's got the little thing on the bottom and the right music and stuff. I like the act of trying to replicate certain parts of stuff. And sometimes I get really caught up in that because it's so interesting to me that I care a lot about the ideas, but I'm really committed to the thing looking like the thing or being a polished, finished product. And I think that actually it would be maybe good for my practice if I could let go a little more and be you know what, I don't have to spend the million hours making this thing look exactly right. It can fail in some ways and still provide the right thinking tool. It can still be the right thing to further more discussion or something. So I think that's a hard line to cross because I just have such a personal commitment to doing things a certain way. And yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question? Okay.
All right. You think that's good? Good. Oh, this doesn't need to be on here. So that's excellent. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.